The old pickup truck slowed to a stop at the edge of an abandoned field. A weary man stepped out, followed by his loyal German shepherd. They said nothing.
Come on, Shadow, we're here.
Just stood there, silently staring forward at what wasn't a house, but the skeleton of an old school bus, rusted and tangled in vines like a forgotten tune. To anyone else, it was a heap of scrap. But for the veteran and his only companion, this was the final option. The decision he was about to make inside that wreck would change their lives forever. Please support us by subscribing to the channel to discover this moving story of revival. Where in the world are you listening to our story from? The silence in the empty apartment was the loudest sound John Riley had heard in years. It was a hollow, echoing void where a life used to be. Every piece of furniture, every picture from the walls, every rug from the floor was gone, packed into the bed of his aging pickup truck, or sold for what little cash it could bring. All that remained was a single, sealed cardboard box on the floor and a stark white paper taped to the kitchen counter. An eviction notice. The final, impersonal judgment on a life that had spiraled out of his control. John, a man in his early 50s, stood in the center of the living room. He was tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that comes from a life of hard work, not from a gym. His brown hair, cut short in a way he'd never grown out of, was shot through with silver at the temples. His face was a roadmap of a hard-lived life, etched with lines of worry, but his eyes, a clear, steady blue, still held a deep well of kindness that hadn't yet been extinguished. His hand trembled slightly as he reached down to pick up the last box, a subtle tremor that was a constant, unwelcome souvenir from his time in the service. At his side, a magnificent German shepherd sat with quiet dignity, his intelligent eyes fixed on John. This was Shadow, a 6-year-old service animal whose coat was a striking mix of silver gray and white, like a wolf touched by moonlight. Shadow was not a pet. He was a lifeline. He was the anchor that kept John from drifting away entirely, the calm presence in the storm of memory and anxiety that raged inside his head. The dog whined softly, a low thrum of concern, and nudged his hand with a wet nose. John managed a faint smile, scratching behind the dog's alert ears. "I know, boy. Time to go." The drive was somber. They left the city behind, the landscape of concrete and noise, slowly giving way to the rolling farmland and dense forests of rural Michigan. It was a green and gold tapestry he no longer felt a part of. He was just a ghost passing through it. He was lost in thought when a semi-truck on the opposite side of the highway blew a tire. The sharp crack echoed across the road like a gunshot. Instinct took over. John's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. A cold sweat prickled his brow. He wasn't on a Michigan highway anymore. He was back in the dust and the heat, the air thick with smoke and the shouts of men whose faces he could no longer place. The world tilted. The scent of burning rubber replaced by something acrid and terrifyingly familiar. Shadow whined again, louder this time, and pushed his head insistently onto John's lap. The pressure, the solid weight of his loyal friend, pulled John back from the edge. He took a ragged breath, the ghost of the memory receding, leaving only the familiar ache of shame and fear. It was moments like these that had cost him everything. The sudden rages, the long nights spent staring at the ceiling, the inability to be present in his own life. It had cost him his last 3 jobs. His eyes fell to the thick manila envelope on the seat beside him. It felt heavier than a brick, a monument to his failure to navigate the civilian world. Inside was a mountain of paperwork from the Department of Veterans Affairs. 18 months. His disability claim had been listed as in process for 18 agonizing months. He thought of the endless hold music on the phone, the confusing forms demanding details of traumas he wanted only to forget, the polite but detached voices that promised to look into it. The system designed to help him had become just another source of paralyzing anxiety. And it had cost him his marriage. Anna's face swam in his memory, her eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness. He could still hear her voice, etched with tears and years of exhaustion. "I can't live with a ghost, John. You're here, but you're not here. I love the man I married, but he never came home." She was right. He had lost their house, their shared history, their future, all because he couldn't outrun the shadows of his past. Finally, he turned off the main highway and onto a gravel road, the tires crunching over loose stones. The road led to the old Riley farm, a place that had been abandoned for 20 years, ever since his parents had passed. He pulled the truck to a stop where the woods opened into an overgrown field. He cut the engine, and the silence rushed back in, this time filled with the chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves. He got out of the truck, Shadow leaping down gracefully beside him. And there it was, his last resort. In the middle of the field, half swallowed by a sea of weeds and tangled vines, sat an old school bus. It looked like the skeleton of some long-dead beast. Rust wept in long orange streaks down its faded yellow paint. Most of its windows were shattered, dark eyes staring out blankly. Vines clung to it like a shroud, their green tendrils creeping through the broken panes and wrapping around the dented metal frame. It was a monument to decay, a testament to time and neglect. It was the only shelter he had left in the world. A wave of utter defeat washed over him. All the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the sacrifices he had made for his country had led him to this, a derelict bus in a forgotten field. He felt Shadow press against his leg, a warm, solid presence. He looked down at the dog, then back at the rusting hulk. "After all of it," he whispered, his voice hoarse, to the silent friend beside him, "this is what's left." Getting the bus door to creak open had been a battle of rusted metal and brute force. Getting it to close again was impossible. John wedged a spare tire against it to keep most of the night out, but the Michigan autumn air still crept in, cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and decay. He unrolled his sleeping bag over one of the less rotted bench seats, the cracked vinyl cold against the thin nylon. This was home now. He shared a bottle of water and a few dry crackers with Shadow, the meager meal doing little to fill the cavernous emptiness in his stomach. The sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the field into a deep, unfamiliar darkness. The only light came from a sliver of moon hanging in the sky, its pale glow filtering through the grime-caked windows, casting long, distorted shadows inside the bus. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, every rustle of leaves like footsteps. For a man whose nerves were already frayed to their breaking point, the symphony of the night was a form of torture. Sleep did not come as a comfort. It came as an ambush. He was back in the sand-choked valley, the sun a merciless hammer in the sky. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear. Then came the whistle, a sound that ripped through the air a split second before the world exploded in a flash of blinding light and deafening noise. Dust and chaos, shouts that had no direction. He was trying to move, trying to find his rifle, but his limbs were made of lead. He opened his mouth to scream a warning, but only a strangled cry came out. "No," the word tore from his throat as he bolted upright in the sleeping bag, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The cold sweat on his skin was real. The terror was real. The bus was dark and silent, but the battle still raged in his mind. A wet nose pressed insistently against his cheek. Heavy paws landed on his chest, a grounding weight. Shadow was there, his silver-gray form a solid shape in the darkness. The dog whined, a low, anxious sound that cut through the ringing in John's ears. John buried his face in the dog's thick fur, his hands clutching the loyal animal as if he were the last solid thing on earth. He stayed that way for a long time, just breathing in the familiar, calming scent of his dog, letting the steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing slow his own frantic pulse. Shadow was his tether to the here and now, the only thing that could pull him back from the ghosts of then and there. The next morning arrived gray and cheerless. John woke feeling hollowed out, the exhaustion of a sleepless night settling deep in his bones. As he was trying to coax a small fire to life outside the bus, he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road. A familiar pickup truck pulled up, and a man leaned out the window. It was his cousin, Mark, a man with a kind face and eyes that were filled with an unmistakable pity that made John's stomach clench. "Jack," Mark called out, his voice hesitant. "Figured you might be out here. Got some of your mail that got forwarded to my place." He didn't get out of the truck. He just held a small stack of letters out the window, avoiding looking directly at the derelict bus. John walked over, taking the mail with a mumbled thanks. Mark gave a curt nod. "You need anything, you call, okay?" He didn't wait for an answer before putting the truck in reverse and driving away, leaving John alone with the mail and the heavy weight of his cousin's concern. He sorted through the envelopes, bills, junk mail, and one envelope that made his breath catch. It was made of thick, elegant, cream-colored cardstock. His name was written on the front, in a graceful, looping script he did not recognize. He tore it open. Inside, an invitation announced the upcoming wedding of Anna Riley to Mr. David Peterson. His Anna, his ex-wife. It was a formal, beautiful declaration of a new life, a happy life, a normal life, a life he was no longer a part of. The invitation was a final confirmation of what she had said. He was a ghost, and she was moving on with the living. He sank onto the cold metal steps of the bus, the invitation trembling in his hand, a wave of absolute despair washing over him. It was over. Everything was truly, finally over. As he sat there, lost in a fog of grief, Shadow, who had been sitting patiently, suddenly stood up. The dog walked to the front of the bus, near the driver's seat, and began to sniff intently at a section of the rusted metal floor. Then, he began to scratch, his claws making a sharp, scraping sound. He let out a low, insistent bark. "Leave it, Shadow," John said, his voice flat and lifeless. The dog ignored him. He whined and scratched with more urgency, looking back at John with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't idle behavior. This was a mission. Annoyance flickered through John's despair. He got up, intending to pull the dog away, but paused. He had learned long ago to trust Shadow's instincts. They were often sharper than his own. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed a tire iron from his truck. He knelt on the grimy floor and wedged the tool under the lip of the rusted panel Shadow had indicated. It took all of his strength, but with a groaning screech of tortured metal, the panel popped loose. Underneath was not just more dirt and decay, but a hollow space. And nestled inside it was a small, dented metal box. His heart gave a curious flutter. He lifted the box out. It was heavy, solid. With fumbling fingers, he worked the rusty clasp open. Inside, protected from the damp by an oilcloth wrap, was a leather-bound journal. He opened it. The inside cover was inscribed in a strong, clear hand, "Property of Arthur Riley, his grandfather." He turned a page, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The 12th of October, 1958. A man is what he makes with his own two hands. Not what he owns or what he's given, but what he builds from the ground up. There is no greater pride. John read another entry. A piece of wood is never just a piece of wood. It holds a story, and it's a craftsman's job to listen to that story and give it a new voice. He kept reading, page after page, a lifetime of wisdom and quiet pride pouring from the book. His grandfather, the carpenter, the builder. A man who created things of beauty and function, while he, John, felt he was only capable of watching things fall apart. He closed the journal and looked at his own hands. They were trembling, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't just from anxiety. He looked at the decrepit bus, at the rust and the shattered windows. He saw it not just as a tomb, but as raw material, a story waiting for a new voice. A resolve as solid and real as the metal box in his lap began to form in his heart. He would not let the Riley legacy end in a field of weeds, buried in rust and regret. He would build. The days that followed blurred into a routine dictated by sunlight and purpose. Fueled by his grandfather's words, John began the monumental task of gutting the bus. The work was a brutal, physical battle against decades of neglect. He ripped out the cracked, moldy bench seats, their vinyl splitting like old skin. He tore down the sagging headliner, which rained dust and desiccated insects down on him. He attacked the rusted floor panels with the tire iron, each screech of metal a satisfying cry of progress. With every swing of a hammer, every pull of a pry bar, something miraculous happened. The roaring chaos in John's mind began to quiet. The hypervigilance that had plagued him for years, making every shadow a threat and every loud noise a trigger, softened. It was replaced by a sharp, singular focus. The precise measurement of a piece of wood, the steady rhythm of a handsaw biting through a plank, the careful consideration of which part of the structure was salvageable and which had to be torn away. This was a therapy no doctor's office could provide. Out here, with his own two hands, he was not a patient or a victim. He was a builder. Shadow was his constant supervisor, a silent partner in the endeavor. The German shepherd would lie in a patch of sun just outside the bus door, his head on his paws, watching John with unwavering attention. When John's frustration would mount at a stubborn bolt or a warped piece of metal, Shadow would seem to sense it, trotting over to nudge his hand with a wet nose, a simple reminder that he was not alone. The dog's steady presence was as crucial as any tool in his box. One afternoon, about a week into the demolition, John was wrestling with a large, rotten section of the interior wall when he heard the unfamiliar sound of a modern car engine making its way up the long gravel drive. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand. A clean, late-model sedan, completely out of place in the overgrown landscape, pulled to a stop. Two figures emerged, and John's heart simultaneously leaped and sank. It was his children. Emily, his daughter, was 28, with a kind, serious face that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She had her father's determined chin but her mother's perpetually worried eyes. Dressed in the neat scrubs of her nursing job, she looked ready to manage a crisis, and in her eyes, that is exactly what this was. Her younger brother, Ben, stood beside her. At 25, he was trying to forge a path in the corporate world, and he was dressed for it in a polo shirt and clean chinos that looked pristine against the backdrop of weeds and rust. He had a look of deep discomfort on his face, the look of a man trying to apply a spreadsheet's logic to a messy, emotional problem. "Dad?" Emily's voice was strained as they approached the bus, carefully navigating the debris on the ground. "What is all this?" A flicker of pride, the first he'd felt in a long time, tried to surface in John's chest. "I'm fixing her up," he said, gesturing vaguely at the gutted interior of the bus. "Making it a proper place to live." Ben's face tightened. He scanned the scene, his mind clearly calculating variables and outcomes. "Fixing it up?" he said, the disbelief clear in his tone. "Dad, I know the VA stuff is slow, but living here and doing this? It's not going to help your claim. They're going to think you're unstable." The small flicker of pride in John's chest died. Ben's words, practical and well-intentioned, felt like a punch. Emily stepped forward, her expression softening with concern, but her words were just as sharp. "And you missed your appointment with Dr. Evans," she called me. "Dad, you can't just stop your therapy to play with this old bus." Play. The word hung in the air between them. They didn't see the sweat, the planning, the sheer force of will it took just to start. They didn't see the peace it brought him. They saw a broken man playing in a scrap heap. This is my therapy," John tried to explain, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How could he describe the quiet that settled in his mind when his hands were busy? How could he explain that the scent of sawdust was more healing than the sterile air of a waiting room? His children exchanged a look, a shared glance of worried agreement that excluded him completely. They saw his explanation not as a reason, but as a rationalization, a symptom. "Ben is right, Dad," Emily said gently, as if speaking to a confused patient. "We need to show the VA that you're stable, that you're following the program. This looks like the opposite. It looks like you're giving up." "Giving up?" he wanted to shout. This was the first time in a decade he hadn't felt like giving up. This was the first time he felt like he was building something, instead of just watching his life crumble. But he said nothing. The chasm between his reality and their perception of it felt a mile wide. Shadow, sensing the shift in his master, rose from his spot in the sun and walked over, pressing his body firmly against John's leg. The dog looked up at Emily and Ben with his intelligent, unreadable eyes, a silent, furry sentinel guarding his person. The visit ended a few minutes later with awkward hugs and promises to call. As their car retreated down the gravel road, kicking up a cloud of dust, John was left standing in the silence. The brief warmth of their arrival had been replaced by the familiar, bitter cold of being fundamentally misunderstood. They thought he was lost in a fantasy, abandoning the path to recovery. They couldn't see that for the first time in a very long time, standing in the wreckage of his past, he had finally found it. The days following his children's visit were heavy with a familiar loneliness. The sting of their misunderstanding lingered in the air, a ghost that even the hard physical labor could not entirely chase away. Still, John worked. He worked with a grim, stubborn determination, fueled by a need to prove something, though he was no longer sure to whom. He'd managed to clear the entire interior of the bus and had begun the slow process of sanding away the rust, the drone of the electric sander a constant companion. One afternoon, as he was meticulously cleaning a set of spark plugs he'd salvaged from the engine, a dusty but well-cared-for old Ford truck rumbled up the drive. An older man, sturdy and compact with a full head of white hair and hands permanently stained with the ghost of old grease, climbed out. He wore clean overalls and a look of frank curiosity. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice a low gravel. "Name's Walter. Live a couple miles down the road. Saw you were working on this old girl. Had to come see for myself." John straightened up, wiping his hands on an oily rag. He braced himself for another round of pity or concern. "John Riley," he replied simply. Walter walked around the bus, his eyes sharp and assessing. He didn't look at the weeds or the broken windows. He looked at the frame, tapped the metal of the body, and peered at the work John had already done. He was not looking at a homeless shelter. He was looking at a project. "She's got good bones," Walter declared, running a hand over the sanded metal. "They built these things to last back then. You're doing a clean job on this rust." He then peered at the thick envelope from the VA that John had left on the dashboard. Walter grunted. "Dealing with those fellas, are you?" John just nodded, not wanting to get into it. Walter shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "That paperwork can drive a sane man crazy, let alone one of us. They make you fight harder for a bit of peace at home than you ever did overseas." The words landed on John like a warm blanket. It was the first time someone had spoken to him with understanding instead of judgment. Walter didn't see a broken man. He saw a fellow traveler navigating a frustrating world. For the next hour, they didn't talk about feelings or therapy. They talked about engines, about the integrity of a chassis, about the best way to seal a roof. It was a language John understood, a conversation that built a bridge between two quiet men. Before he left, Walter said, "I've got an old engine hoist in my barn that might make your life easier when you get to that motor. Just say the word." Walter's visit was a balm on John's bruised spirit. The recognition from a fellow craftsman, the simple offer of help without pity, gave him a renewed sense of legitimacy. He wasn't just a crazy man in a bus. He was a man working on a project that another skilled hand could see and respect. A few weeks later, John had turned his attention to the interior. He had salvaged a small, beautifully made wooden cabinet from the back of the old farmhouse. It was dusty and weathered, but the dovetail joints told him it was the work of a master, probably his grandfather. He'd spent days carefully restoring it, but one of the drawers was hopelessly stuck, warped by years of dampness. He had tried everything, sanding the edges, oiling the runners, but it wouldn't budge. His frustration mounted, the familiar tightness coiling in his chest. The stuck drawer felt like a metaphor for his own life. As his anger began to bubble, Shadow, who had been dozing nearby, got up and trotted over. He ignored the stuck drawer and went straight to the back of the cabinet, which was faced against a wall. He began to nudge the thin back panel with his nose, letting out a low, insistent whine. "Not now, boy," John sighed, trying to wiggle the drawer again. Shadow was persistent. He nudged the panel again, harder this time, then gently scratched at the wood with his paw, looking back at John with an unwavering gaze. John stopped. He knew that look. Shadow was trying to tell him something. Trusting the dog's strange intuition, he moved the heavy cabinet away from the wall. He ran his hand over the back panel. It seemed ordinary, but as Shadow nudged a specific spot again, John noticed a slight seam he hadn't seen before. Using a thin putty knife, he carefully worked it into the crack. To his astonishment, the panel wasn't nailed in. It was held by small, hidden wooden pegs. With a soft click, a section of the back came loose, revealing not the cabinet's interior, but a shallow, hidden compartment. His breath caught in his throat. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cheesecloth, was a small collection of items. He reached in with a trembling hand and pulled them out. There was a faded photograph of a 5-year-old Ben, beaming with pride on his first two-wheeled bicycle. There was a crayon drawing of a stick figure man holding a little girl's hand, labeled in shaky letters, "My Hero Dad." It was Emily's. Tucked in an envelope was a lock of blonde baby hair and a tiny hospital bracelet with the name Emily Riley printed on it. These were treasures he thought had been lost to time and divorce. Mementos from a life he could barely remember living. They had been carefully saved, not by him, but by his own father, hidden away for safekeeping. John sank to the floor, the small artifacts spread out before him. These weren't just memories of a happy past. They were proof. Proof that before he was a soldier, before he was a patient, before he was a ghost, he had been their hero. He had been a father whose children looked at him with pure, unconditional love. He looked at the gutted shell of the bus around him, and his purpose, which had been a general desire to rebuild, sharpened into a fine, clear point. He wasn't just building a place for himself to live. He was building a sanctuary for these memories. He was building a home worthy of the father his children remembered in these precious, forgotten relics. He was building a space to prove that the foundation of their family, though buried under years of pain and misunderstanding, was still there, waiting to be uncovered. The Michigan landscape slowly surrendered to the coming winter. The brilliant golds and reds of autumn faded to a somber palette of brown and gray, and a persistent chill hung in the air. But inside the yellow school bus, a quiet and profound transformation was taking place. The hollow, echoing shell that had once been a symbol of John's despair was now becoming a sanctuary of warmth and meticulous craftsmanship. John worked with a focus he hadn't known in years. With Walter's help, he had managed to get the old engine to turn over, its rumbling growl a promise of future journeys. Inside, he had framed the walls and packed them with thick insulation, a barrier against the encroaching cold. The floors, once rusted and broken, were now covered with smooth, reclaimed pine planks that he had sanded and sealed until they glowed with a soft, honey-colored light. He had built a small, efficient wood-burning stove into one corner, and its gentle heat filled the space, chasing away the dampness and the ghosts. The work changed him. The hands that had trembled with anxiety and the aftershocks of old traumas were now steady and sure. They knew the feel of wood, the heft of a tool, the satisfaction of a perfect joint. The mental fog that had clouded his thoughts for so long had begun to lift, burned away by the intense concentration required for his tasks. He was no longer just a veteran, a patient, a divorcee. He was a craftsman, a creator. He was the man his grandfather had written about in the journal. One Saturday afternoon, a familiar sedan made its way up the drive. It was Ben, but this time he was alone. Walter had called him a few days prior, talking not of John's well-being, but of the impressive progress on the bus. Curiosity had finally won out over skepticism. Ben stepped out of the car and stopped, his mouth slightly agape. The bus was no longer a derelict. The exterior had been sanded and primed, its bright yellow hide replaced with a coat of deep forest green that blended beautifully with the surrounding woods. A proper chimney pipe now rose from the roof, a thin curl of smoke rising from it into the crisp air. "Dad?" Ben called out, stepping closer. John emerged from the bus. He was wearing a flannel shirt, his face smudged with sawdust, but his eyes were clear and bright. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and gestured for Ben to come inside. The change on the outside was nothing compared to the world within. Ben stepped up into the bus and simply stared. The space was a marvel of function and beauty. Custom-built cabinets and benches lined the walls, their warm wood grain glowing in the light from several new, properly sealed windows. A small, functional kitchenette was taking shape on one side, and on the other, a cozy sleeping bunk was framed in. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke. It smelled like a home. John watched his son, letting the work speak for itself. Ben walked the length of the bus, running his hand over a perfectly flush cabinet door. He looked at the clever way John had built storage into the wheel wells. He saw the neat, organized bundles of wiring that were ready to be connected to a power system. This wasn't the frantic, desperate project of a broken man. This was the methodical, thoughtful work of a master craftsman. "This is," Ben started, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is incredible." "She's coming along," John said, a quiet pride in his voice. "Still a lot to do, but she's solid." Ben turned to his father, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at a patient or a problem to be solved. He was looking at his dad. "I've never seen you this focused," he said, his voice soft with a dawning understanding. "Not in a very long time." It was an admission, an apology, a bridge. In that moment, Ben began to see what his father had been unable to articulate. This wasn't an escape from therapy, this was therapy. The most effective kind. It was rebuilding a life, by literally rebuilding a space to live it in. "The work helps," John said simply, and Ben nodded, finally understanding. When Ben left that evening, the conversation was different. He didn't talk about doctors or VA claims. He asked about types of wood, about the challenges of the electrical system. He left not with a feeling of dread, but with a newfound respect and a sense of wonder. As the first snowflakes of winter began to drift down from the gray sky, John knew the project was nearing a crucial stage. The physical structure was almost complete. Now, he had to try and rebuild the family that was meant to fill it. He sat at a small, sturdy table he had built himself. A single lamp, casting a warm pool of light. Shadow lay at his feet, his head resting on John's boots. John took out a small stack of simple, cream-colored cards and a pen. His hand was perfectly steady as he began to write. He wrote one to Emily and one to Ben and his wife. The words were not fancy, but they were honest, stripped of all pretense. They read, "The bus is finally a home. It's warm and it's finished. I would be honored if you would join me for its first real meal next Saturday evening." He signed it simply, Dad. He placed the two cards in their envelopes. This was harder than any piece of woodworking, more nerve-wracking than fixing an engine. It was an invitation not just to a dinner, but back into his life. He had built the foundation. Now he could only hope they would be willing to step inside. The Saturday evening arrived under a sky the color of slate, with the first serious snow of the season beginning to fall. The fat, silent flakes drifted down, blanketing the field in a layer of pristine white. Against the growing darkness, the bus glowed like a lantern. Warm yellow light poured from its new windows, a beacon of impossible warmth in the cold, empty landscape. John stood at the door, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He had checked the roasting chicken a dozen times. He had straightened the simple hand-sewn curtains. Everything was ready. All he could do now was wait. Right on time, headlights cut through the falling snow. A single car, Ben's sedan, made its way carefully up the drive. 3 figures emerged. Ben, looking less like a corporate manager and more like a hopeful son. Emily, her face anxious but open. And a woman John had only met a few times, Ben's wife, Laura, a quiet woman with kind, observant eyes. They stopped a few feet from the bus, their awe silencing any words they might have prepared. The forest green bus, with its warm, glowing windows and a steady plume of smoke rising from its chimney, looked like something from a storybook. It didn't just look restored, it looked alive. "Dad," Emily breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "It's beautiful." John's smile was small but genuine. "Welcome home," he said, and pushed open the solid wooden door he had crafted. The warmth and the scent of roasted chicken and fresh pine hit them first. They stepped inside, and their polite amazement turned to stunned silence. The interior was a masterpiece of warm wood, soft light, and clever design. The table was set for 4. The small wood stove radiated a comforting heat. In that moment, it was impossible to believe this space had ever been a cold, derelict shell. Laura, the newcomer, was the first to speak. "John, this is breathtaking. It's like a tiny, perfect cabin. The craftsmanship is just wow." John felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. He showed them around, pointing out the kitchen he had built, the sleeping area, the systems he and Walter had engineered. He spoke with a quiet confidence they hadn't heard from him in years. After they had explored every corner, John led them to the wall opposite the kitchenette. "There's one more thing I wanted to show you," he said, his voice growing thick with emotion. There, mounted on a beautifully paneled section of dark reclaimed wood, was the memory wall. It was a small, curated collection of handcrafted frames, each one unique, each one holding a piece of their shared past. Ben stepped closer, his eyes fixed on a photo of himself as a small boy, grinning on a bicycle. Emily's hand flew to her mouth as she saw her own childish crayon drawing, the faded letters still proclaiming her father as her hero. She reached out and gently touched the glass of the frame that held a tiny lock of her own baby hair. The careful way it was presented, the love that was so evident in every handcrafted detail, unlocked something deep inside her. Tears began to stream down her face, silent and heavy. "Dad," she sobbed, turning to him, her face a mask of love and regret. "We were so wrong. We were so wrong. We thought you were running away, hiding from everything, but you weren't. You were fighting, right here, in your own way." Ben put an arm around his sister, his own eyes glistening. He looked from the wall to his father, his expression full of a new, profound understanding. "We were so focused on the right way to get better," he said, his voice cracking. "The doctors, the paperwork, the appointments, we didn't realize you were healing yourself by building something, by creating." The words, so full of honesty and remorse, were the key that finally unlocked the door between them. The years of misunderstanding, of frustration and worry, simply dissolved in the warm light of the bus. John pulled both of his children into a fierce hug, burying his face between their shoulders, a single cathartic tear tracing a path through the sawdust on his cheek. Shadow, who had been watching from his spot by the fire, got up and padded over, pushing his head into the center of the family huddle, a silent, furry confirmation that their circle was once again complete. The dinner that followed was the most honest meal they had shared in a decade. They talked and they laughed. John told them stories about his grandfather's journal. Ben and Emily told him about their lives, not the curated, careful versions, but the real stories, with all their struggles and triumphs. Laura watched it all, her gentle smile reflecting the joy of seeing a family find its way back to itself. Later, full in content, Ben unrolled a road map on the table John had built. "You know," he said, tracing a line with his finger, "this thing has an engine. We could take it to see the Great Lakes next summer, all of us." Emily's eyes lit up. "Or the national parks out west. Can you imagine?" John looked at his children, their faces bright with plans for a future they would share. He looked at the warm, beautiful home he had built from the wreckage of his life. He looked at Shadow, his ever-faithful companion, now dozing by the fire. The compass of his life, which had been spinning wildly for so long, had finally found its true north. It wasn't a place on a map. It was here, in this moment, in this circle of love. Outside, the snow fell, covering the old farm in a blanket of peace. But inside the bus, a family, once broken, was celebrating a new beginning, proving that the strongest homes are not built on perfect foundations, but are carefully, lovingly, and resiliently rebuilt. John and Shadow's journey reminds us that true healing often begins not when we are given what we need, but when we find the courage to build it with our own two hands. If their story of resilience and a dog's unwavering loyalty touched your heart, sharing it can help spread that hope to others who may need it. We would be honored to read your thoughts about their beautiful home in the comments below. By subscribing, you become part of a community that believes in second chances. We have another very special story waiting for you, and you can watch it right now by clicking the video that has just appeared on your screen.